the company didn't start out trying to do a social network at all. The original stealth name, we were a stealth name. Original stealth name of the company was Citizen Lab, and eventually we launched a service called Audio, which was a podcasting service. And so we had this idea that we would build a desktop application and an aggregator and audio production tools, and we worked in sort of a very traditional old school startup way, which is we didn't tell anybody what we were doing, and then we tried to get as much attention as possible in the press. And what that does is it creates this situation where you build beautiful software that everybody loves in the demo and no one wants to use. So I highly recommend you do not follow that model of entrepreneurship. It started out with a small team. There was an initial guy, Noah Glass, who had an idea for how to build it, how to create it, and he pulled together first some contractors and a little bit of angel money, and we ended up launching it sort of simultaneously at TED Global and in the New York Times at the same time. So it was all about the sort of 1.0 rocket ship launch, put a bunch of marketing energy behind it, and hope that you get users behind it. And in the process of preparing it to launch, is this one working? No, this one isn't working. Okay. In the process of preparing it to launch, we had done a few things that were tricky and a few things that were horrible ideas. First, we'd gone to Apple and talked to them about a deal. So we showed them all of our stuff before our launch. And Apple went, oh yeah, podcasting, that's a neat idea. No, we don't want to work with you. And then Apple went and launched all of their podcasting integration in iTunes and basically took all of our ideas. Now, the ideas aren't worth very much. The implementation is worth a lot. But that one thing of having the sort of the 700-pound gorilla in your space it really took the wind out of our sails. And so just as we raised our Series A round of about $5 million, we had this thing of, oh, and your company is completely irrelevant, and you're not going to succeed. And so we got all this attention, all this press, but the traffic numbers just weren't going up. Maybe if we hadn't raised a bunch of money, we could have built an SEO play around traffic, about giving web pages around each podcast and each episode, because they weren't very discoverable. But it wasn't enough to justify the venture capital investment. It wasn't going to be that 100 or 1,000x return that you needed to make the VCs happy. And so what happened was the VCs said, fire everyone, shut down the office, sell off the intellectual property, maybe sell the company if you can. And so we went around trying to sell the company, and no one wanted to buy it. And so a little over a year into the company's history, we were at an impasse. We still had about $3 million left in the bank. We had about a dozen people on the team at this point. And we had a beautiful product that everybody in the press loved and no one wanted to use. And so everybody's like, oh shit, what are we going to do? Now what you would call that is a pivot. You'd be like, okay, let's pivot the company. But really, in 2006, in January 2006, it was more just an oh fuck moment. And so we'd heard about this idea, and we played with this concept of hackathons. This idea of, well, what happens if we just build something really quickly? And a number of us in the program and the company had done a Rails Rumble, which is like a 48-hour build an application in a weekend and launch it. And so we had this idea that we'll just take every Wednesday until the company runs out of money or some idea comes along, and we'll just build something. And everybody has to build something, and the teams can't be the same as who you normally work with, and it can't be something that someone actually wants on the backlog. It just has to be something crazy. And we did that for about 2 months. And through that process, we started building a lot of things that were quite similar. A lot of things that were sort of in the space of social networks, a lot of things that were playing with what is media, what is text messaging, how to use phones, what would a reinventing voicemail. This is before the iPhone came out, so there was no sort of concept of iPhone's visual voicemail. So we just started hacking on things like that. What would what would groupware be? What would mailing lists be if they were rethought of? That kind of thing. What's the future of blog readers? And we built and launched a whole bunch of little products. And we usually launch them either to friends in the office or very publicly, but we didn't want anyone to know of it. And one of those products that we launched in this one-day experiments was something that was called FriendStalker. And FriendStalker was this way of just posting information online about what you're doing and letting your friends get text messages that were updates of it. Now, someone decided that FriendStalker was a really terrible name, and it got renamed Twitter because one of the guys got really obsessed, and I think he drank a lot of Red Bull, and he opened up a dictionary and started at the beginning looking at every page to find a word until he got to T. And Twitter is a word in English which means little short messages or the sound that birds make. And so it turns out that there was this word that perfectly described the service that was completely disused in English. Now, when we went to go register the domain name, it was already registered. So we registered twttr.com, which was good. It's short, text messages, until someone said, oh, twatter. You guys launched a service called Twatter, and it's not about porn. Amazingly, the domain name Twitter only cost $15,000. It didn't take too many twat jokes to get us to buy the domain name. The interesting thing was, to me, that Twitter was not a runaway success. It was not a huge big deal. When everyone went in and tried to use it, when we got all of our friends to sign up about it, no one thought it was a really good idea. You can go back and you can read the original TechCrunch article about Twitter, and it says something like, this must be the stupidest change of direction of a startup we've seen in a long time. I went around and signed up. Everybody went around and tried to sign up as many of our friends as possible, and almost no one wanted to use it. Basically, they said, so I have to pay 10 cents to receive each text message on my phone, and you want to send me ones that I don't want to read, that aren't dedicated towards me. And we're like, yeah, sort of what's going on in your friends' lives that's not important enough to tell you. And so it seemed like it was not going to work. But about 100 people, after a couple months, kept using it. And people around the office kept using it, to say what they're going to have for breakfast, or they're late on the bus, or things like that. And that small percentage of people who actually started using it had tremendous engagement. And this ends up later being something that Eric Ries talks a lot about, sort of as one of the examples of how do you know if your startup's a good idea? And you know your startup's a good idea if people say it's dumb and they hate it, and some people use it a lot. If people just say it's dumb and no one uses it, then you have a dumb startup. If people say cool and don't use it, then you also have a bad startup idea and you need to pivot and to keep exploring. But if people say, I fucking hate it, and keep using it, then it means something. And in this case, we had people who were paying hundreds of dollars a month to keep using it to their phone companies so that they could use Twitter. It got to the point where the company started paying for the phone bills, the mobile phone accounts of the employees, because to use the service was so expensive. Now, eventually, the model for text message delivery in the United States changed, and it was figured out a way to make it cheaper. But it was sort of an indication of someone is willing to pay for this, even if we can't figure out how to get them to pay us. Now, my particular role was I was the sort of first employee, lead developer, started out in cafes and eventually moved to an office. When we split off the teams, I got stuck with fixing audio in the old site. And eventually I thought that was really boring and I quit. But the concept of founders quitting, early employees quitting, to me leads to an interesting idea, which is no one knows what's going to be successful. That no one on the team knew, even 3 years into the company, that wow, this is going to be a world-changing idea. This is going to be a major thing that some group of people in Chile or some other place in the world wants to hear about. If you look at every major startup that you see go around, almost all of them, the founders went and tried to sell their startup for nothing. It happened to Apple. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak went to HP and tried to sell their startup, and HP just didn't want to buy it. It happened to Twitter, where the original venture capital thought the startup was so valueless that they went back and tried to shut it down, even though there was still $3 million in the bank. So eventually they were putting a value at 30% of Twitter at negative $3 million. And you know, I have a friend who had a social networking site, VC-backed startup out of Boston that did social networking for university students, and he met this kid at Harvard who had a site to post photos of yourself. And the kid wanted $1 million for this site, the Facebook. And my friend Ahmed said, oh no, the Facebook, it's nowhere, never going to be worth $1 million. But Zuckerberg was asking for that. Like every single time you see this, no one knows. Because no one knows where it's going to go. And this is the problem with investors too. If the founders of the companies have to put up a face that says, yeah, we're going to be successful, we're going to change the world, we're going to build this huge company, and they don't know, the investors who have been successful through it and have experienced and watched it from the other side, they know that they didn't know either. And the companies that you see be successful, they're just, they successfully played the lottery. Now, the tickets are expensive. It takes you a year, 2 years each time. Each time you do it, you pick it, you can pick your odds, you can play how to improve it. But in each of these times, you really never know how it's going to fail or how it's going to succeed. You only sort of know afterwards that it succeeded. So when you go and you see programs like StartUpChile, the reason there's 300 startups a year, in part is because it's an admission that you just don't know which one will be a world-changing company. One of the things that I thought is really interesting and different now versus 10 years ago. So remember, Odeo, the company that created Twitter, was founded in November 2004. Is now startups are a thing again. So in San Francisco and Silicon Valley in the late 90s, internet was everywhere. Internet's going to change the economy and everything else. And then it all collapsed, and it's like all internet companies are frauds and scams. And so by the time Flickr and Twitter and all these companies were getting started in 2004, 2005, there was no money, there was no investing. It was a dead field, and everyone was just playing around to build things. And no one thought that you would make any money. Remember, the startup that sort of defined Web 2.0, defined the idea that you would have users and a social network and social relationships, and people would contribute content to these sites, and it wouldn't just be either shopping or end users. Flickr sold for $34 million. A decade later, Instagram, the same amount of time into the company, with the same number of people, 13 people, sold for $1 billion. So one, there's much more economic upside right now. It's much easier to raise capital, but there's also some other differences. It's much easier to get exits, not public IPOs, but through selling companies. And there's a whole series of platforms that exist today that didn't exist then. There's platforms for marketing. There's YouTube, and there's AdSense, and there's SEO, and there's all these different tools, the social graph that you get on Facebook and Twitter, all these tools are essentially meaning you're building on top of other people's platforms and other people's tools, which can be risky because they can pull the rug out from under you, like when Twitter did the really unfortunate thing of screwing its developers to try and save its platform. But it also means you get there much faster. I have a friend who had a company, which you probably don't know about, called upcoming.org, public events calendar. He sold it to Yahoo when Yahoo decided to be a Web 2.0 company. And at the time when Andy created Upcoming, he couldn't create any kind of, he had no way of finding out that you two knew each other. He had no way of looking it up, except for maybe asking for your email login and attempting to search it, but there wasn't even unification on webmail at the time. Now all those problems are solved, in which case you can much more easily get to the problem of how do I iterate on ideas and try and find product market fit on top of these platforms. The other major shift, of course, is all the stuff with Lean Startup, getting rid of the myths that were wrong about how startups work and replacing them with techniques. So traditionally, all startups that were successful went through a process of being lost and experimenting and throwing stuff against the wall and seeing what sticks and trying to figure out how to structure everything. But once they got to the end of being successful, they threw away that real history of how messy it was to get there, and they replaced it with an idea that the light bulb went off in my head, and we had this idea, and we built the first version we thought of, and it was working. And we didn't have to hire any marketing dollars, and we didn't have to iterate, and we didn't have to launch 24 versions of the applications. We didn't have to do any of that because we had the genius with the perfect idea. That genius with the perfect idea never existed. It was just really useful story to pitch after the company was successful. So the important difference now is, now you have things like a lean canvas, you have this idea that you should be testing hypotheses as opposed to writing a business plan, this idea that you should A/B test every idea, that you should launch stuff. We've reconstructed how you build products in ways that are really important. You reconstruct how you build products as a series of experiments. And you admit that no one on your team knows what the hell's going on. You're just smart people trying your best. And you do these experiments. And that difference is, along with the platforms, why startups are much cheaper now. It used to take hundreds of millions of dollars, and then tens of millions of dollars, and now it takes hundreds of thousands of dollars or a couple $1 million to get to that inflection point. And that's a huge difference, because now you can get either revenue or growth much faster. It means that you can move forward. The other huge difference is now we have a software as a services business model. I launched a software as a services company in the late 90s and started in 98 for events calendars, for social calendars, competing with the alternative weeklies, sort of what concerts are going on. And at the time, we had no business model. We went to try and sell these to bars and theaters and everyone else, but it didn't occur to us that we could charge them on a regular basis, a certain amount per month. Now, you have things like average revenue per user and cost per acquisition. You have whole services that let you model out the software as a service platforms without actually even having to build the software as a service. It used to be that you built the service and then tried to sell it. Now we know that you can just skip to the selling it, and if no one clicks the buy button, you didn't have to build it. Sort of that process is powerful. Getting back to Twitter a bit, a bunch of people sort of wonder where the hell the idea came from. And the idea came from having a bunch of people in the room, a bunch of people on the team, who had been working as entrepreneurs. We had a whole string of a dozen failed startups between us. And we had a whole string of different products and ideas that we'd always wanted to build, and products that we'd used, services we'd used that we really liked. And so we started throwing out ideas on the whiteboard. One of those ideas was a university system that let you put used .plan files on Unix, and you could write little messages, and then you could finger each other and see the updates of the messages back and forth between people. And so you could sort of see status updates from everyone. Another was a bicycle message sort of delivery dispatch system that was for sort of within New York, bicycle messengers get dispatched to move documents from one office to the other. And so a dispatch system was built, and a failed startup. Another was a project that I was working on that wasn't a startup at all, that was a text-based social network using your mobile phones specifically to coordinate protests. So the idea was during a protest you wanted to find out where the police were and what news was going on and what building you were going to occupy and everything else. And so in 2004, 2006, this thing called TextMob was used during a lot of protests in the US. And let's see, what are the other ones? Oh, the other one was this idea, and this is really useful when you're thinking about startups, the idea that every time we have a medium of communication that shifts, the companies that work and the services and tools we use in that medium either get destroyed or they have to reinvent themselves. So if you look at it, you say, what was the company that was dominant in the world when there was client-server computing? What was the company that was dominant in the world when you had dumb terminals? So it was DEC. And then it went to client-server. Oh, and then it went to desktop. Oh, IBM took over. And then it went to graphical interfaces, and there was a fight between Microsoft and Apple over who could dominate it. And then it went to the web, and the Yahoos of the world took over as who were the dominant people. And then it went to mobile, and you see companies like both Google and Apple fighting over who's dominant. And each time there's a platform shift, there's a moment by which all the incumbent players for every role and activity in the economy and in social space gets replaced. Either the company can adapt into this new space or they can't. But the applications, the businesses that people use will get replaced. This is why you see Facebook spending $1 billion on Oculus, the VR, because they know people are going to flop the web. This is why you see them spending $1 billion on Instagram and on like $19 billion on WhatsApp. They know that the web today as a desktop platform is going to die. And they're going to use the cash in their bank to try and buy their replacements, buy as many of them they can, all the hopeful ones, so that they can dominate the next generation. And so some companies like Apple and Microsoft have been particularly good at buying up their potential future competition. And some companies have failed at it. You know, Yahoo was completely dominant. The Google people went to go sell Google to Yahoo. Yahoo said, no, we don't want to buy it. And so the transition from sort of Web 1.0 to Ajax and this sort of new web with big data, Yahoo missed it and got crushed. But if you know that this transition happens, and you know that on a regular basis we're introducing new mediums of communication, you can just look at the old models and apply the new ones. And so the case of Twitter was, look at what people did on Unix, look at what people did on desktop, look at what people did on IM, and said, what if we had smartphones? We don't have them yet, because there was Symbian, like the Nokia phones, but this was before the iPhone came out. And it was like, well, what if this transition does happen? What if we're going to get there and it does happen? How do we build something that's ready to take over? And Twitter was really lucky and was able to sort of take over that mobile smartphone adoption, and it had enough of a platform there that it moved forward. But you can apply that to anything. You can also apply it sort of the idea of anything that hasn't yet been taken over by software will at some point. Software eats the world. Any part of the economy, any part of society that isn't currently using software will switch to it. And you say, well, what does software mean? Low-cost airfare. The low-cost carriers, the airlines that do this, they are essentially a software business that controls airplanes and manages it. And so they took the old model of smart people in a room deciding what airfares and what routes to run, and they replaced it with software will control ticket prices and routing. And now you have Ryanair and Southwest and all these airlines that manage to be much more profitable than the traditional airlines that don't use software to run their business. Now, traditional airlines use a lot of software, but their core isn't software. And so you can take any industry, wineries or trucking or anything, and say, well, what happens if the human processes and the bureaucratic processes we do now were replaced with software processes? And that's why the startup process, that's why we're seeing a boom in startups, is because basically we've gotten to the point where we can, with mobile phones and web and with big data, we can replace every single part of the economy. And the truth of the matter is we've barely touched the surface of replacing the existing players. The last thing that I think made Twitter work is this idea of learn from your customers, learn from your users. None of the important ideas that you think of as being essential to Twitter came from Twitter, the company. Twitter, the company, launched this service, sort of stumbled into this idea of sending messages and this sort of blog-like follower relationship, and then opened it up and opened up the APIs and opened up control. And so there was no approval to build applications, there was no approval to do anything. And the community built all the applications. The community created the idea of the @reply, using @ for your username. That was not something that Twitter, the company, adopted or supported. For a long time, there was actually a big campaign inside the company to try and prevent people from using @username. And the hashtag was the same way. It was some users who started using it back and forth and said, oh, maybe we can have this thing. The real-time search was another company that applied their technology to do searching. So this dynamic creation of communities and conversations was something that was created on the outside. The retweet was something that was created on the outside. All of the things that sort of make it possible, make Twitter useful to create this collective conversation, those were created by the community and then adopted by the company. The applications, this idea of a desktop or mobile application, was created by the community and then adopted by the company. There were two other companies that were essentially identical to Twitter at the same time that Twitter got launched. One of them started 6 months, a year before Twitter, and one of them started a little after. The earlier one was a company called Jaiku that came out of Helsinki, and the later one was called Pounce. Now Jaiku, coming out of Helsinki, where Nokia is from, they built the Nokia app. And then they went and they tried to build an actual mobile app and a desktop app for every platform. And they didn't open their API. And so the only way to use Jaiku was use their apps. So they didn't create a space by which their users or developers or hackers could build upon their platform. And Pounce did a very similar thing. They wanted to add media. And they wanted to have photos and videos. So they built a desktop application that let you embed photos and videos. What Twitter did was, oh, people are sharing links of photos and videos. Let's show them in line eventually. So the idea of let your community drive your innovation and make it bigger is important, because inside your company, you do not have the smartest people in the world. You do not even have the smartest people who care about your product or what you're using it. So you need to create a space by which you sort of open that up and incorporate that and use your users to learn instead of fighting against your users. Because you see all the time companies that fight against their users. Or they say, well, you're not using the software right. Any way in which they're using it successfully is using the software right. Your job is to learn from those users. And yeah, I'm not sure I should have more. There are probably questions. I had a presentation talk, and now I'm just rambling. Yeah?
Following essentially what your users tell you and continue experimenting leads you to no substantial progress, because essentially you're just giving small incremental improvements to what people want and you never make any leaps. What do you think?
So it's interesting. So I think that there's definitely people who follow sort of orthodox, I read the books and I'm doing exactly as the startup ownership manual or the lean startup, I'm doing exactly the steps do it, and you can be over-orthodox. You have to remember that the lean startup techniques are an extraction of what has worked so that you can pick and choose things to move forward. They're not a prescription of what you should do. It's useful to have a vision. It's useful to know what you're doing and push it forward. The tricky part is if you say, this is my vision and I'm going to go build it, it's fantastic, and push it forward, and I don't care what people do, is usually that you're wrong. Usually you build something that no one wants to use. And that's why most software projects fail. It's important to validate your ideas. Yes, you can get stuck in sort of local maxima, local points where you've optimized for something really dumb, but you get lots of engagement. It's true. But the other part of it is big systems get built with small pieces and in small steps. So if you said, I want to build Facebook, that would be a terrible idea. And in fact, anybody who starts off saying, I'm going to build Facebook or replacement of Facebook, is the path towards disaster. Look at the Diaspora project, where Diaspora didn't say, we're going to do one small thing well. They said, we're going to take down Facebook and we're going to do it federated. And you know what? It was really, really hard. And that's where big software projects fail. And so if you look at what is successful, you look at PayPal, for example. The little teeny things make it successful.
So he gave the example of, yes, you do validate, but you have the vision.
Yeah.
So you have the vision because you want to give a 10x or a 100x improvement of whatever value people consider important.
Yeah.
But you start by dominating a very small market.
Yep.
That's what PayPal did. They just focused on some collector items. They got 25% of the market in like 3 weeks of that, and then the next 3 weeks they got 25% of another market.
Yep.
And then they moved on. But he said, we knew from the start that we wanted to change the way.
Yeah, he's lying. No, because PayPal started out as a hardware company doing near-field payments. Like they knew they wanted to do payments and stuff, but they literally started out building electronics and hardware. And eventually they ended up in a company whose primary business is fraud detection. And so, yeah, he knew he wanted to be in the payment space. He knew he wanted to do it. But the end, they had no idea that their actual value add, while they were soldering out electronics to do near-field payments, was going to be big data fraud detection. Yes, they did payments. Yes, that was their vision. But the thing that ended up being successful was something they discovered much later on. The problem with all startups, and this is a problem I face myself too, is once you're successful, it's really easy to construct a story in your own head about how you got there. Because the one path you took obviously is the right path. And there's always only going to be one path to success. But there's 10 million paths to failure. And so someone could take 1,000 right turns and one wrong turn and not know how to correct for it and fail. And so studying the success of startups, studying what worked at Twitter won't really be very successful. I mean, it's fun to talk about it, but won't really be successful for your company. Because, there was a lot of drugs and a lot of alcohol and a lot of partying and things like that. And one of the founders, his marriage failed and everything else. It's like having your marriage fail, that's not likely to lead to success. But it's what led to the name Twitter. And the name helped a lot. Noah's wife was leaving him, and so he didn't have any place to go home to. So he spent all night for weeks and weeks looking at the dictionary till he found the perfect name. I don't recommend you doing that. It sucked for Noah. But this idea that you experiment and learn and you need to readjust, that's what's useful. Having a vision is super important, but you'll never get there. Other questions? Yeah?
Have you seen any patterns that kind of serve as a good indicator when your idea is a
Yeah.
So like, how can you possibly know, like, will it take 3-4 years of this like flat line? Like, what's kind of the big indicators you see?
Yeah, it's a really hard question because you're in the middle of it and you're spending time and money and eating up your life. And I've seen people go down the path. I had some friends who had a startup, and the startup was it failed, but it was a middleware company. So they collected Internet of Things data for like the industrial internet, so for machines and everything else. And they provided a big data layer on top of that, and then it connected off. And it's a perfectly reasonable idea. You get all these data things pulling together. And they gave up after, 8 months or a year into the startup. How do we know that if they didn't spend another 6 months, year, trying to launch stuff, twisting it around, pivoting around, iterating on ideas, that it would turn around and be successful? How do we know that, that a year into Twitter, it would really take off where it was not before? So there's a couple hints you can use. A really good one is, do people solve this problem already? So Airbnb knew that there were people who did short-term rentals of their apartments, and Airbnb knew that that was a model that people did, and they knew that it was hard to find it. So they knew the activity happened in a kludgy way. And that's an important one. Like, they knew that, I'm not trying to invent a new social process here. I'm trying to create a more efficient market for it. The other is they went in and they knew that if they could get it in a small area, it might work. So they didn't launch everywhere. They only launched during the Republican and Democratic national conventions in a particular city where they tried to jumpstart it, and during South by Southwest. So they picked a few small areas where they can do experiments. And they got some traction in there. But I would say that a huge number of startups either fail because they didn't try 1 month longer, and a huge number of startups go on many years longer than they have. Like, that's the mystery. That's the why people sell their companies for $1 million instead of $1 billion, because you don't know. But engagement matters. Do people really do it? Is someone paying for this matters? And does someone do this process already? Sort of those things matter.
How long did it take from where you already had the concept Twitter, but it seems to me that the market wasn't mature enough, but you were sort of struggling.
So just
how long did it take where you were kind of in the flat area?
Sure. So to give you a little bit more broader time frame, the initial team came together in November 2004 with I can't remember, it was $20,000 seed investment from Evan Williams, and then the team worked until January, and then there was a $200,000 investment, and it launched in the end of February. And over that first year, maybe 6 more months happened, and a $5 million round happened. And then all through 2005, we worked on podcasting. In January 2006, we said, oh shit, this isn't working. And we started doing the hackathons. So January, February, March, there were hackathons. Beginning of March, there was a decision of Twitter, a team, 3 people were set aside, Noah Glass, Florian Weber, and Jack Dorsey. The 3 of them were set aside. Okay, you guys will work on Twitter, and the rest of us will keep on the real company. And it took about 2 weeks from this is a prototype we built in a day, to this is something we're going to start using internally and maybe invite friends and family to. So that's the first actual tweet, sort of end of March 2006. The first 6 months until October, there was very little traffic growth. In October 2006, the ability to send and receive messages via REST, so via an API, and RSS and Atom features got launched. and the ability to chat with Twitter. So you could use a chat app like AOL Instant Messenger to chat with Twitter. Those all launched October, November 2006. It started to get some growth there. And then by March 2007, during South by Southwest, everybody used it to find out which bar had free alcohol. And that was the moment in which everyone said, oh my God, Twitter's going to change the world, it's awesome. So there were several stages of it. But I would say from March to October 2006, there was only a very small number of passionate users, and there was no uptick anywhere else. And then it was 4 or 6 months of moderate growth, and then after South by Southwest, it was the hockey stick of oh shit, doubling every month. Servers always crashing.
When you figure, because it seems to me that by then you were having like an idea, a concept, you were still struggling. But when you find the business model to make that happen,
the business model for Twitter never existed while I was at the company. The business model was always, if you get 100 million users using your system, we will figure out a way to make money off of them. No, I mean literally, for years it was, if we can get to 100 million users, and people are using it every day, there's got to be a way to make money off of it. Now, that is not the sort of orthodox lean startup way of doing things. There's what's your average revenue per user, where's your traffic, what's your business model, everything else. But Twitter never figured that out. It was always, if we just have a lot of users. And that's partially maybe why Twitter has always been a much smaller business than its impact on society. Like, it's economically quite a small business, but its social and global impact is quite large. Whereas there's other businesses that have huge economic impact on the world, and no one knows they exist. Yeah?
I'm curious about the hiring process. When they hire you, they have like an investment where what does the founders tell you to get to the company?
So it's an interesting thing. I wouldn't say that it had a deep evaluation of me when they hired me. Noah and his friend Evan Williams had gone to 37 Signals. Do you guys know about 37 Signals? Anyway, 37 Signals, a consultancy that turned into a kind of lean startup-y type lifestyle business, Basecamp, and a bunch of other tools. They've been running a series of workshops about how to do startups, rethinking the way people do startups. And in 2004, they released this Ruby framework called Ruby on Rails that everyone thought was crazy, and it was full of magic and everything else. And I'd been attempting to build my own model view controller, object relational mapper, sort of agile web development framework in Perl at the time. And so there was a small community of sort of people trying to change the way web development happened in 2003, 2004, and a whole series of these experiments. And so I was one of the first people to do Ruby on Rails. I think there was like 5 or 6 people in the IRC channel when I joined. And I went around to everyone and said, Ruby on Rails is awesome! And everyone said, you're insane! And I was like the only person available in Silicon Valley in the San Francisco Bay Area who did Ruby and did Ruby on Rails and had any Ruby on Rails experience. And to be perfectly honest, I think they thought I was a pot grower, hippie. Like they didn't check my background or everything else. It was like, oh, well, the hippie says he knows Ruby on Rails, and no one else applied for the job. I wasn't growing pot, just for the record. But my hometown, the place I grew up in, it's sort of mostly known for marijuana. So it wasn't unreasonable, their suspicion. I was living in a VW bus that I had parked in the Mission and had all these hippie friends. And basically, there was no one else around doing, like they decided they wanted a really cutting edge technology and forward thinking. And there was no one else around doing it. And so I got the job. And then I, as building the team, and I've hired a lot of people since then, I don't look for skill set and I don't care about what university you went to, everything else. I care, do you have the ability to think and learn and work hard and collaborate as a team? Like, are you a good fit? Are you self-motivated? Are you someone who can learn? Are you someone who can contribute something interesting and different? And so that was sort of the rules were, what the team was built was, is this someone that we want to hang out with? Is this someone we think is brilliant? Is this someone who's interesting? Is this someone who can work hard? Interestingly, we had at some point there was 10 or 12, 13 people, I don't remember how many. There was 2 people on the team who had master's degrees in computer science, and the rest of us were all college dropouts. And we actually had more trouble getting the people who had master's degrees in computer science to sort of buckle down and be productive, building production code, because they were too academic and they overthought things. And there was something very pragmatic about the college dropouts. So I'm a huge fan of college dropouts. Someone asked about Peter Thiel and is encouraging people to drop out of college. I think there's nothing wrong with university. It's a great way to spend 4 years. It won't teach you how to be an entrepreneur. It won't teach you how to build software. There was a sort of an idea that you should look for not what people can, what was recommended. We didn't care about resumes, everything else. Can this person work hard and be creative and take on a lot of roles? Because early hires in companies are sort of like founders, as in they have to wear 1,000 hats and do 1,000 different things. Other questions?
Yeah, you talked about consumer-driven innovation and bringing those changes in. How do you do that without actually killing the developer community and environment around your products?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
How do you bring in those changes developed by the developer community into your product without actually embracing or killing the developer community around your product?
Well, that's very tricky. It was particularly tricky and destructive in the case of Twitter, where they went in and there's been a lot of changes in direction of the company. So there were a number of a developer conference and a bunch of stuff launched, and it was very public. And then there was tremendous fear in the company that someone might use this openness to take over the platform and the community, and very, very poorly executed an attempt to control it. But most of the time when you've seen it done well, no one is afraid of Amazon taking over because you host things on Amazon Web Services. Amazon's done a tremendously good job of building a platform that they use for themselves for all their hosting and then opening it up as a separate business model, everything else. And so I think the answer is be very clear. Be very clear where the economics work. Be very clear what the agreement is, and stick to it. And don't change your story, and be honest. To me, the single biggest mistake that Twitter made was they went out and fought their developer community when they were afraid. There was a venture-backed company that was buying up Twitter applications to try and hijack the community. All they had to do was say, okay, we're going to run ads on and if you have a Twitter application that people view it, you have to show the ads, and this is the revenue split. And so they could have taken all these developers and they could have made them into partners by paying them for all the tweets that got viewed and all the ads got viewed by these users. In which case they would have, because they're running revenue back and forth, had the ability to audit these applications and figure it out, and the application developers would have the ability to do it. Now, there was complaint that maybe there'd be fraud and everything else, but there's fraud in every kind of marketplace that could have been dealt with. There's huge amounts of fraud in AdWords and AdSense, but Google has made it into a cash cow. In Twitter's case, they never considered running the ads on the application developers and making them into real partners. And so the application developers ended up being the enemy, and that really was difficult. With the latest developer conference that happened, there's now a new attempt to return to embracing the developer community and building applications for mobile, which I hope will work. I think a return to this openness and collaborating with the developers, and opposed to seeing the developers as sort of the other side, is a really positive step. A new question.
Okay. A couple questions. How do you grow a beard like that? Because I still can't do that. But and the second question is, you said it's hard to see, what companies are going to be successful. So when you invest in companies, what do you look for? Because obviously you want to invest in companies that are going to be successful yourself.
So I look for a few things. One, I invest in friends' companies because, if you have friends and you invest in their companies, and then you don't have to worry. It's nice because you get to go meet them and see what they're doing, and you get more information about what they're doing in their companies and everything else. And you get these really friendly investor update emails. If you ever have investors, send them a really nice investor update email every single month. What worked, what didn't work, how much cash we have on hand, how much we spent last month, what are our key metrics, how many months we have left, and what are my key asks from my investors. So I have 3 companies I've invested in the last year. 2 of them have female CEOs, and both of them do a really, really good job at communicating where the company is. And I get this update, and I know exactly where their burn is and everything else, and I know exactly what their asks are for me. And the other one does shit jobs of communicating, and I have no idea if they're running out of money or not. So I look for a few things. I look for, I'm in talks with a StartUpChile company from last year, which I think is doing interesting stuff. And so I found them through a mutual friend. I look at AngelList. I do see what my friends and contacts invest in, and occasionally there's a space or something that's interesting. So I look for something where it's software can change an industry. I look for something where I think that it's really bureaucratic and stuck, but I think it's replaceable. I look for something where I think that there's a business model there. I look for something where I think that someone understands their own space and their own industry. And I look for something where it feels like the founder will go through hell and high water to make it happen and won't give up. And I almost always, and this is true of all investors, use the opinions of people I respect. And so the demo days are useful and all that other stuff, but the truth of the matter is it's all about a social network. Other questions? Yeah?
If I remember correctly, Twitter rebuilt into Scala, right, instead of from previously?
It's more complicated than that, yes.
Well, I was going to ask you, I know that's kind of like a trendy kind of language now. And I was thinking about how Paul Graham wrote a blog post in 2010, how Python used to be the obscure language that no one was using. But it was a good way to determine who really liked to code and who didn't. Because people who were learning it weren't people who were trying to get a job, those people who just really liked to code. Do you think that Scala's kind of now taking that place, and that's why Twitter went that route?
No. Well, one, the rewrite of the database and the queue system into Scala happened in 2008, 2009, 2010. We're now 4 years after that. So that was a long time ago. I hate Scala, but the truth of the matter is that no system that's useful, I think functional programming gives me a headache, but the truth of the matter is that no framework or system you use when you get started will ever be right for when you start scaling. And so as you start scaling, whatever technology you use, you're going to have to rip things out as they fail on you and replace them. But don't do that before they fail on you. I did a consulting for a while with a company called Bettable, and Bettable ended up pivoting a bunch, but it was a social betting platform. And it was a company that had to get gambling licenses. And so they raised their money, and they went off and they had these lawyers and business people spend a year and a half getting gambling licenses to do this social gambling application. And they hired engineers at the same time they started. And these engineers had nothing to do for a year and a half. And so they started patching the Ruby programming language to scale stuff, because they thought maybe that would be a problem in scaling that they had. And so many times people are concerned about scaling in language and what they should use long before it ever becomes a problem. Wait till your system is like, read high scalability, pay attention to it, know how to fix things when things break. But use the simplest thing that could possibly work now. Now there's a tricky balance between sexy technology and things you're not excited about. When you want great developers, look for that sexy technology that does not have job listings. So, building web applications in Go, a perfectly smart idea right now, because there's not that many jobs in Go. The language has just gotten to stability. It's quite nice and everything else, quite scalable, but you can't go hire someone. Building a system in Java is a really terrible idea. Because most people who are still using Java, the JVM is nice. I don't want to insult the JVM. It's fantastic. There's a lot of things you can do with it. But the point at which is you want to basically have people who are constantly playing with new technologies. When Odeo started, Ruby on Rails was at 0.86 or something. Like, it was way pre-release. And we were so crazy about it, you know what we did? We did a subversion pull of the edge of Ruby on Rails and deployed that into production. Like, we did continuous deployment by every commit deployed into production, pulling whatever current edge Ruby on Rails pulled off. Now we had unit tests, we had full test coverage, it rolled back automatically if it didn't work, everything else. It wasn't as crazy as that, but it was like, no one was holding us back from the most extreme technology we wanted. And you get way better developers when you do that. And in fact, you can get really fantastic developers for really, really cheap if you let them use cool technologies. Now, one of my good friends and my co-founder of my first startup is now CTO at Etsy. Etsy is an artisan marketplace. It's a $2 billion a year marketplace, everything else. It uses lots of sexy technologies. But when they want something when something is not innovative in their systems, they have a philosophy which is, if I'm excited about it, it shouldn't go into production. And so you need to balance if I'm excited about it, don't put it in production, with you can get way better engineers if you just do shit you're excited about and it shouldn't be in production. So you have to really balance that tricky part out. And so when you're small, the new languages, everything else, give you a huge productivity boost, both because you can get the 10x better programmers and because they're way more productive. As you scale and things break, then that's the question of, well, maybe we're using the wrong weird NoSQL database and we should roll back on something more stable. Yeah?
I know you're on the engineering side, so you work mostly on the tech part. And when you started with Twitter, it was about 10 years ago. So my question is, 10 years ago, the web was really different from what it is today. Specifically, it was ugly. Not like 20 years ago, I mean, that was plain ugly, but you didn't have usability tests, you didn't have graphic frameworks for the web, you didn't have mostly anything. And at the time, solving a problem, and just solving a problem could work.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about it today. What do you think? I mean, how much?
I mean, so when we built Odeo, it was one of the first sites that was built from the ground up using Ruby on Rails. And it was one of the first sites that was built from the ground up, pure CSS. There were some images in there, but it was like heavily CSS. In fact, like our login button didn't take you to another page. It popped up a little thing where you could log in line. It didn't reload the page. Everybody went like jaws dropped when we threw in a little bit of Ajax, because the term Ajax didn't exist. So, yeah, in some level, like, we had pure CSS, and we had Dan Cederholm, who wrote a number of books on CSS. He did all of our CSS and design, and there were no frameworks on top of it. It was a lot of work to make the sort of the elegance of the application together. Now, there's bootstrap and everything else, and all these other things. Now you have like all of our JavaScript was custom JavaScript. There was no frameworks, there was no jQuery, there was none of these stuff that you could do. There's a lot that makes you develop faster and move forward, and you should totally use that. You know, I've been playing with Meteor lately. Meteor reminds me of the magic. Meteor's now old, it's been around for a while, but it reminds me of the magic of Ruby on Rails, with a sort of no clear distinction of whether or not you're in the browser or on the server, of where the code's going to execute or anything else. Like, that stuff makes you more productive. But that doesn't mean that the problems have been solved. Here, I mean, the real thing is, the problems we're facing and the reason we're doing startups is we're taking parts of the economy, all of the economy and all of society that wasn't mediated by software, and we're replacing it with software. We've just barely touched the surface of that. All these tools make it faster. But take any part of the economy you understand. Maybe it was what your parents did, and look at it and replace it with software. Say, what would happen if any process that was human was replaced with software? And so the tools to do that are much easier and much faster. And there's a lot of companies trying to do all this. But I actually think it's not like, yes, maybe, there's the social web space, social media thing, and there'll be always churn in there. But there's a huge rest of the economy possibilities that are just untouched. One thing, so I'm friends with the guys who started GitHub. GitHub was started in a bar. It was actually started at a meeting called I Can't Has Ruby. And I Can't Has Ruby was a secret Ruby meetup. So when I started doing Ruby in San Francisco, there was nobody doing Ruby. By the time I finished and left San Francisco 3 or 4 years later, we couldn't even go to our own Ruby meetups because there were all these recruiters and sort of .com business people who were desperately searching for founders. I'm sure some of you are those people. They were searching for like a co-founder that was technical to like build their idea. So we did this secret Ruby meetup. And at this secret Ruby meetup, we talked about just what we wanted. And so there was these bars and alcohol and drinking, and everyone said, oh, I want a hosted Git. Wouldn't Git be awesome? Git's this crazy technology that only Linux kernel hackers use. And so they applied good user interface onto this thing. But GitHub, like competing with GitHub is a terrible idea. Or competing with anything that serves other developers is a terrible idea because every developer can do it. Which means the quality that you see of tools for developers is really, really high because everybody can scratch their own itch. And the quality of software in startups and businesses we see everywhere else, everywhere that isn't a programmer doing it, is really low. So all the low-hanging fruit is not in the area of developer tools and programmer tools, anything a programmer needs. You just ask what kind of investments? I really don't like investing in things that other programmers can solve. Because the quality of it's just fantastic. And everywhere else it's crap. Other questions? Yeah.
Any advice on gaining traction? Like what kind of things did you do with Twitter?
Well, I'm not sure that Twitter had a lot of failures in getting traction. So remember, my position was in the company for the first couple of years, and then I was a friend of the company and hung out, and I had access to the code repositories and root on all the servers for probably 3 years after I left. But so most of the trying to get traction stuff happened after I left. They hired a biz dev guy, and he went down to Hollywood, and he said, this Twitter thing is really awesome. Actors and everyone in Hollywood and musicians, they'll really like it. And he went around and he pitched it and he pitched it and he pitched it, and he got the assistant writer of the sitcom My Name is Earl to sign up for Twitter. And that was Twitter's first celebrity, was the script writer, the assistant script writer for My Name is Earl, the TV show. And then a number of people on the team really like partying, and San Francisco has this thing called the Love Parade. It's like San Francisco's copy of the Berlin Love Parade. Everybody gets drunk and naked in the middle of the summer in San Francisco and dances to techno and takes lots of ecstasy. And so Twitter tried to sponsor this and pass out flyers, and like it didn't work Turns out people were just interested in their drugs and sex and not interested in Twitter. And there was attempts at sponsoring the MTV Music Video Awards, everything else. It was a little later, it worked a little bit better. There were a lot of failures in trying to get people to sign up. And there was always the idea, oh, celebrities will love this. And until some celebrities actually started using it and realizing they could connect directly to fans, there was no use. So I think Twitter is mainly useful for an example of how to fail at that. Now you can do things like you can, A/B test landing pages and things like that. You can run ads and try and generate organic traffic and everything else. We did focus groups. We brought in women in their late teens and early 20s and did focus groups and tried to figure out how they use text messages. Trying to build a service for that. That didn't really work. But we're not, Twitter wasn't the only company that failed at this. YouTube built their service and launched it, and they noticed that no one was uploading videos to YouTube, and so they started posting ads on Craigslist offering women to pay women $100 if they would post naked videos of themselves on YouTube, thinking that maybe naked videos, porn might save YouTube. And it didn't work, actually. It turns out that posting creepy ads on Craigslist is not a way to attract porn actresses. What did work for them is they looked at the hits. Someone posted a funny cat video, and they got to the end of it, and they stopped. And so the insight in YouTube is they show up other links, and they make it from one spike of traffic to continued growth. And so I think that even if your growth or what hits is random, the question is, how do you keep them? And so that's why we talk about YouTube and we don't talk about Vimeo or the 2,000 other video startups that all started at the same time. It's because they figured out how to take advantage of their occasional hits and build the viral loop. In the case of Twitter, once someone started using it, their phone was beeping all the time and it brought up conversations, everything else. And there were these spike moments of there be an earthquake and everyone, wow, look, I heard about the earthquake from my phone 30 seconds before I felt my room shaking. Or, it hit the news. Someone was on a ferry and an airplane crashed in the Hudson River in New York, and they took the first picture of it and posted it on Twitter. Those kind of spikes, the question is, do you take the power, and I've seen this in a bunch of other social sites, do you take advantage of that growth, and can you keep people after that? But you have no idea what the spikes are going to be. Yeah?